I'd like to introduce our next guest, one of my favorite living philosophers and the author of the great book Explaining Postmodernism. In episode 1 of this podcast, we talked at length about postmodernism, and we analyzed some of its central claims. We talked in some depth about its role as an antagonist of sorts to the project of liberalism and Western civilization, and we considered the extent to which postmodernism is a kind of oppositional force to the Western literary tradition. My next guest, Stephen Hicks, while he's a strident critic of postmodernism and one who seems to reject nearly all of its central tenets, claims that postmodernism is actually part of the Western canon and the Western literary tradition. Postmodernism is part of our story, he claims. It's part of the great conversation. In his book, Explaining Postmodernism, Stephen Hicks traces postmodernism from its roots in Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Immanuel Kant to its development in thinkers such as Michel Foucault and Richard Rorty. In his book, Stephen provides a provocative account of why postmodernism has been the most vigorous intellectual movement of the 20th century. Why do skeptical and relativistic arguments have such power in the contemporary intellectual world? Why has a significant portion of the political left, the same left that traditionally promoted reason, science, equality for all, and optimism, why has it now switched to themes of anti-reason, anti-science, double standards, and cynicism? Explaining Postmodernism is intellectual history with a polemical twist. It provides fresh insight into the debates underlying the furor over political correctness, multiculturalism, and the future of liberal democracy. Stephen Hicks wrote another book that I thought was very good called Nietzsche and the Nazis. Stephen is a professor at Rockford University. He's the author of numerous articles and essays, and we're very proud to have him on the show. Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Jordan. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for being on the program. I really appreciate it. So I want to start with this. You're a philosopher, and what would you say at this point is your area of expertise?
Good question. Well, my career has fallen into what seem to be 7-year chunks, where I work on something for 5 years or so, a lot of reading and writing short pieces, and then 2 years on a book, and then I move on to something else. My roots are in kind of epistemology, logic, philosophy of science, but then I've done a great deal of work in kind of modern and contemporary European intellectual history, and then in recent years I've been doing also a lot of work in entrepreneurship, but entrepreneurship from a philosophical perspective.
So I noticed that I did a little bit of research, and I noticed that you're also an adherent of Ayn Rand. So this, to me, makes you a very fascinating figure, especially since you're ensconced in the modern American academy, and yet you're a vocal proponent of Ayn Rand and the objectivist philosophy, or at least that is how it appears to me. And, you know, from being a humanities student myself, you can't help but notice that Ayn Rand is somewhat of an exiled figure. You know, she, at least in the humanities disciplines like English and philosophy, she is persona non grata. So how has the modern academy received this interest of yours? And to follow up, do you feel that Ayn Rand has been unfairly maligned in modern scholarship? Is it just an aesthetic sort of aversion to what she stands for? Is it a lack of understanding regarding her ideas?
Well, I would say all of those things, right, in varying degrees. Probably the most important thing is going to be the politics there. The 20th century among Western intellectuals was dominated by various degrees of leftism, and Rand is a strong proponent of free market and liberal ideas, liberalism taken in a fundamental way. So all of the political vituperation is going to be directed at someone who's on the other side of the spectrum. Now, another component of this is that the academy in the 20th century was professionalizing itself a lot, and Rand was not a professional intellectual. So there's sometimes it comes out in the form of a snobbishness that unless you're a PhD credentialed academic at a institution of higher education, we can't really take you seriously. And certainly writing on you is not going to give one any academic credibility. You can't put it on your CV, right, and so on.
Right.
But at the same time, I do think it's more the politics that's more fundamental because, there's all of the vituperation that's directed at Rand, but that same vituperation was directed at thinkers like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek. Everyone will recognize that those guys are geniuses, but they were credentialed academics and Nobel Prize winners and so on. So I think it's a double whammy in the case of Rand. Although I think she also had two other things working against her in terms of reception in the academic world. One is that she was an intellectual warrior, and she, kind of like Nietzsche, whom I know we'll be discussing a little bit later, has kind of a take no prisoners attitude when she's dealing with her intellectual adversaries. People like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek are much more urbane in their rhetorical format. So anybody who comes out swinging, as Rand does often
right.
when they're talking about other acts, is going to get people's backs up and they're going to react a certain way. The other thing I would say is I think you said something about aesthetics right along the way.
Right.
I do think that's an important and understated thing with respect to Rand, because in some ways Rand is greatly out of step with the sensibilities, right, of 20th century intellectuals and academics. She, I don't want to use the word throwback, but she was an heir to the Romantic tradition, right, coming out of the 19th century.
Yeah.
With this kind of high optimism about human progress and the potential of not just outstanding individuals, but people of ordinary capacities to do something special and significant with their lives. And that rubs most of the major 20th century intellectuals, particularly humanities intellectuals, right, the wrong way. For them, they're significantly much more pessimistic. If we just survey the artistic landscape of the 20th century, if you see artists as channeling the humanities zeitgeist, there's a lot of breaking up and pessimism there. It's it's an intellectual culture, right, dominated by political leftism, much of which is very pessimistic and seeing the world as agonistic. Existentialism, with its perceived gloominess and emptiness of life, right, is dominant during Rand's lifetime. And also you used to have to take major historical events. How does one respond to World War I, followed up fairly closely by the Depression, and then followed up again pretty closely by World War II. So that kind of strong optimism and romanticism that's in Rand does strike many as out of step. So, I think those 4 points will explain a lot.
So let's shift on to postmodernism. I was blown away by your book, Explaining Postmodernism. It was something I found out about from Jordan Peterson, who held your book up and said, "You must read this. You have to read this. It's very important." And
well, thanks to Dr. Peterson.
You start in your book by explaining postmodernism as kind of a reaction to modernism. Can you tell our listeners what is modernism? I thought the summary in your book was incredible. And what is postmodernism? And how are the two philosophies sort of in conflict?
Right. That's a very important question, and we have to scale out, I think, in two dimensions to grasp what's going on. Partly postmodernism is a philosophical term, and partly it's a historical term. Let's start with the historical term. If you take your standard Western Civ courses, arguments among the historians, but something like the last half millennium or so, 500 years, we are into the modern era. There was a significant number of intellectual and cultural revolutions, right? Revolutions in religion, the rise of humanism, splits between Protestants and Catholics, rise of religious toleration, scientific revolutions, the birth of modern physics, modern chemistry, modern biology, industrial revolution, transformations of invention and engineering, that working with kind of economic and business revolutions where we have mass production and mass logistics and distribution networks and so on, rise of modern capitalism, new forms of finance, stock markets and so on, political revolution. So all of that, right, we can say when we get 200, 300, 400 years ago now, and we look at what's going on in the Western world, it's dramatically different from the way things were 1,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago. Now, what the postmoderns are saying is that now in our generations, right, the last 40, 50 years, right, or so, we are undergoing an equivalently significant number of revolutions in our own culture. So partly the historical claim is that modernism's culture has run its course, that there's nowhere for it to go, that the course that it has run has resulted in strongly negative pathological outcomes in all of the major dimensions. And what we are seeing now in all of the disruption and the ugliness is the coming to be of a new kind of culture that has to be given a different label, and that will be postmodern.
Well, can you briefly unpack that, because that is one of the claims, the historical political claims, that confuses me. What do they mean by modernism has run its course, and how does that square with the reality of the facts? In terms of increased lifespan, in terms of childhood mortality declining by something like 49%, in terms of places that, the world poverty rate was virtually cut in half in the past 20 or 30 years. It seems like modernism is doing a pretty good job. Right.
Well, the first issue just is to assess what the postmodern claim is, right? And they are making the claims, right, that in all of the political, economic, social dimensions, things are negative. So, the debate, right, over technology, right? One side, of course, the modernists will tell a heroic championing progressive story about technology. The postmoderns come out of the tradition that plays up the downsides, right, of technology. So the first just is, if our question is what is postmodernism? Postmodernism is the claim that modernism has run its course, and when you do all of the assessment of modernism's institutions, you should reach fairly pessimistic conclusions. Now, you're then asking the follow-up question, right, which is, is the great question, to say, well, how can you possibly be so negative, right, about the modern era, since it also seems, even if you're moderately pessimistic, to at least have had some successes, right? And then we can start running through various successes about poverty rates and life expectancy, right, and so on. So if you don't mind, why don't we put that on the back burner, right, for a little bit, because then we can say, can we assess the legitimacy or the strength of the postmodern critique of modernism? But the other side of your first question, what postmodernism is it's not only a kind of a cultural historical set of claims, but it is a philosophical, right, set of claims. And so the important thing here is, if you focus on the big league postmodern thinkers, right, people like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Lyotard, Richard Rorty, and so on, in my estimation, those are the most powerful strategic thinkers, right, in postmodernism. All of them are philosophers, right, by training, with PhDs in philosophy, and they are staking out positions on all of the major categories of questions that philosophers deal with. So they are making metaphysical or anti-metaphysical claims. They're making epistemological claims. They're making judgments about values and human nature, and then, of course, more broadly about politics, right, and economics. So there, the contrast is between what they took to be the modern philosophical framework. And again, this is very high-level stuff, right? The modern world has many movements and sub-movements, right, that are going on right within it. But if you again survey the last 400 to 500 years, the dominant intellectual framework philosophically is naturalistic, right? We see the physical world as a self-contained world of cause and effect. Mm-hmm. That we study it through the scientific method and various social scientific methods. But individuals use their reason, they gather data, they test hypotheses, and they exercise individual judgment, right, and so forth. So that whole network of philosophical claims, the postmoderns will challenge and say philosophically, we now think those are untenable. So all of modernity's dominant philosophical positions, the broadly speaking Enlightenment framework intellectually, is just wrong, and we need to reject it in toto, and whatever the future alternatives are, that's what philosophically we need to embrace.
Right. So I was reading a passage in your book, I believe it was by Lyotard, that talked about how Saddam Hussein was a product of the West, just like Hitler and Mussolini, and that these figures are products of Western political institutions, capitalism, and ideas that define the West. And suddenly, reading your book brought me back. It was like Proust's Madeline cookie. It brought me back to Cambrai. I was an undergraduate in philosophy and English, and I had to read Madness and Civilization by Foucault. I had to read Wretched of the Earth by Fanon, Anti-Oedipus by Deleuze and Guattari, and I think something or other by Lacan. It was all over the curriculum. So I know students are being inundated with this stuff, and I remember my biggest problem with postmodernism at the time was that I realized this is entirely a deconstructionist movement. It doesn't replace modernism or science or reason with anything. And there's a quote in your book by Stanley Fish, who writes, "Deconstruction relieves me of the obligation to be right and demands only that I be interesting." Well, in my view, there's an issue with this, that we have real problems in the world that need to be solved. Not even postmodernists can deny this. They're always bringing up the problems that we have. And we always necessarily use reasoning and facts and logic to solve these problems, as well as the notion of proof, which they seem to be against. So my question is this: what's the end goal of postmodernism? What would the utopia look like? Do postmodern philosophers, critics, professors, do they see their philosophy as being an ultimately productive one, a useful one, a philosophy that is enabling of human flourishing? Or are such notions as usefulness and productivity, are they problematic, is a word that you'll hear over and over again? Are they problematic in themselves? And if their philosophy can't address these things, then why should I care? Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting network of observations and questions, right, that you're putting out there. I think the short answer would be to say that there is no end game for the most consistent and ruthless, right, applications of postmodernism. Postmodernism, right, as you're pointing out, is largely negative, right? The language of deconstruction. The language of problematizing everything, seeing everything as a problem. If you push that right to its end limit, then what you say is everything flows, nothing abides. There is no ultimate standard of goodness or ultimate goal toward which we can have progressive aspirations. Instead, the postmodern project just is to point out the futility of all previous attempts in Western and other traditions to try to find some sort of end goal and figure out how to get there. So in that case, they are simply puncturing everyone's balloons, right, in a very deep way, and everything is ultimately going to be deflated. Out of that, then what is going to come? The postmoderns would say, I don't know. Nobody can know. All we can do is just see what happens, right? Western civilization, all of civilization in whatever forms it takes, Western or Eastern, are ultimately going to decline, fail into conflicting pathologies, and we're just along for the ride. Now, that's one answer. I don't think that all postmodernists, right, are in that category. Postmodernism again, is a very broad, right, movement. And just as with modernists, there are several major variants and subvariants and so on. There are variants within postmodernism, right, and subvariants, right. So it's the difference between then saying, there's a big divide between those who are religious and those who are not religious in their understandings, right, of the world. And knowing that someone is religious tells you something significant, right, about them. But then very quickly you get into, well, there are a dozen major religions, right, kicking around, and each of the major religions has a dozen more subvariants, and at some point the subvariations and the things that divide them also become very important.
Right. But unlike religion, I've actually never met a postmodernist that will admit to being a postmodernist. They reject that kind of labeling in the first place, and so there are many people who I would put in that basket, whether or not they will admit it.
And that's a fair point. Partly because when we are using labels like modernism and postmodernism, we're operating at a very high level of abstraction. We're trying to chunk 3 or 4 centuries worth of history and put a big label on it, right? Or we're trying to talk about entire philosophical systems and put big labels on them. But part of the postmodern package is a skepticism about any capacity for human beings to look out at the world and categorize things in certain ways and function accurately at a high level of abstraction to understand, right, what's going on. So they will, while being, right, postmodern, as we would identify them, reject that as a legitimate labeling, right, for what they're doing. But to go back to your question about Lyotard and then the follow-up quotation, right, from Fish, right, and so on. Fish, I think, fits better in what we were just talking about before. One reaction to deconstruction and postmodernism is just to say, okay, so there is no truth, there is no objectivity, nobody knows anything, and so forth. So let's just play, right? Let's just be interesting, right? And so the quotation that you mentioned, I no longer have an obligation to be right. I only have an obligation to be interesting. That's representative of kind of a playful response to this and a more aesthetic, right, response to this. We'll just do what's fun, and there's no end game here. We'll just play a game for a while until it's interesting. Then when it stops being interesting, we'll go off and do something else. The quotation from Lyotard, we haven't yet talked about the politics, but when he is arguing that Saddam Hussein, right, and so forth, is a product, right, of the West, we're getting an indication there of the strong Marxist, right, or neo-Marxist politicization, right, that's typically part of the postmodern package as well. So there we have Lenin's imperialist theory of history, kind of updated for the end of the 20th century. So, you and I and others, right, we might look at someone like Saddam Hussein and say he is a dictator, a very successful dictator of a certain sort. He actually was kind of national socialist with the theocratic, right, overlay to it, and so we apply standard modernist, right, categories to understanding him. He is a bad guy, right? We are the good guys because we're on the side of freedom and democracy and openness and so forth. And so maybe there's a just war case for deposing this dictator and hoping something better will come out of it. So, but Lyotard and the others right, are arguing that any time in the third world, or in many cases in places in the second world where there's a problem, that you are blaming the victim, right? Anytime you hold them responsible in some way for their problems, that they have this very strong kind of high-level Marxist framework, that it's strong versus weak, oppressor versus oppressed, rich versus weak, and you apply that at the international stage. And then the Lenin contribution is to say, in the rich countries, the rich capitalist countries, they are developing their own internal contradictions and their own internal problems. But one way they disguise that is by exporting all of their problems to the third world. So it's just like, people in the nice rich neighborhoods produce a lot of garbage, but they'll store their garbage in the poor neighborhoods, so it becomes invisible. The rich countries will take all of their garbage, all of their problems, and push them out into the third world nations, making the third world nations even worse. And so therefore, the pathologies are going to rise up in the third world nations, but it's not primarily the third world nations. So Lyotard is saying that someone like Saddam Hussein, right, is, and here we get the oil argument, in an oil-rich country, but the West is all about capitalist control of the oil, and so they are, stirring the pot in the Middle East. And causing the kinds of conditions that make the rise of dictators like Saddam Hussein come up. So again, the West is going to be blamed, right, for the problems in the Middle East, and the target then is critique. Now, that's a long-winded way of getting back to your question about what's the end game. Right, for postmoderns, and one of the answers I said is to say, well, there is no end game. But another kind of end game is to say that the point of all of the deconstruction, the point of the relentless criticism of modernity and of all Western traditions, and the insistence in trying to find clay feet, right, even on its apparent successes. That all of that is a destabilizing move, right, in the service of hoping that out of that destabilization and the mess and chaos that follows, that some sort of cultural leftism will be able to prevail. Right. So if you can't, so to speak, take Western institutions on headlong, right? If you can't say, we have this alternative vision of society, right? Suppose you are some sort of leftist and you can't point out a successful leftist model as a shining example for people to look up to and emulate, but you still, in your heart of hearts, right, want some sort of leftist ideal to prevail, what you need to do then is just destroy, so to speak, the existing apparently successful models, recognize that is going to be very ugly, that there's going to be a lot of brutality and conflict come out of it, but then just hope that your side in that brutal free-for-all will prevail, and the ground will be cleared for you to do your thing.
From this vantage point that you're describing, postmodernism seems not only to be destructive, which it aims to be, as you said, but a little bit immature and trollish, right? It's like the grown-ups at the table are trying to have a serious intellectual discussion, and the kid across the table is sticking his tongue out and kicking people's legs and not engaging. And I don't believe for a moment that when Stanley Fish says that deconstruction means he doesn't have to be right. Only interesting that in his books he's not spending the entire book trying to be right. And another question: how can you deconstruct anything without using reason? How can you have an entire philosophy devoted to tearing down, say, Western philosophical concepts without making arguments based on criteria of soundness and validity?
Yes. On your first point about the kid throwing a temper tantrum, how far down that kind of psychological explanation we can go, that's a very interesting question. I think, again, we would need to take postmoderns as a group and break them down into subgroups, because I think there are some postmoderns who are much more clear-eyed and strategic, right, in their approach. And while they are being deconstructive, they're not doing it in a temper tantrum-y kind of way. I think that would be more characteristic of younger postmoderns, perhaps intelligent, sensitive young people in their teens, maybe in their early 20s, who they're not fully mature, either emotionally, right, or intellectually.
Right, I see what you mean.
But they know enough postmodernism, so to speak, to be dangerous, and that does play into their emotional an intellectual immaturity and does come out in kind of psychologically destructive forms.
But Stephen, I think that the social justice warrior, the younger postmoderns, I don't think that they know they're postmodern. I think that they think they're very, very, very right. I don't think that they have the problem that older postmodern generations had, where the issue was we were worried about moral relativity and things like that. This younger generation, some of them aren't moral relativists. Many of them are just saying, I'm a leftist and I'm right.
Yes.
It's a kind of knee-jerk moral certitude from that leftist worldview.
Yes. And that picks up the second half of your earlier question about how can one be a deconstructionist, right, without deploying rational arguments. And I think that is true of first-generation postmoderns. All of them were very highly educated and sophisticated in their argumentation, well-versed in what was going on in academic philosophy and academic linguistic theory and so forth. And so from their high-level philosophical perspective, I think what they would say is they were deploying reason against itself, right? So you take the reason game seriously with all of its language games, you get inside that system and you tease out its implications, but what they take the end result of that to be is to show that that rational language game is ultimately self-defeating, and they're pointing out the self-defeatingness, right, of it. Now what then happens is subsequent generations is if people say, okay, so reason and rationality and logic and concerns with validity and so forth have been shown to be a fraud or in some sense self-defeating, you would expect in the next generation for people not to learn that skill set, right, as well. So whatever it is that they're doing, right, with their minds is going to be less rational, right, and more something else, right, more emotionalist, right, more physicalist, right, and so forth, until you get to the point where people will have lots of conviction, right, lots of belief and a willingness to act right on their beliefs, but they don't have the intellectual training and the rational argumentation right to justify it. So at this point, and I hope I don't just start to sound like an old guy right at this point, but yes, I am seeing an increasing number of people who are coming out with PhDs. And they are intelligent and clever, right, in one way, but in many respects they are incredibly undereducated, right? They do not know the best arguments for and against on all of the major issues, and they certainly do not know the intellectual history and the cultural history, right, very well,
right?
Because they're now second or third generation postmodernism that says, there's our entire intellectual and cultural traditions that you just don't need to worry yourself about because they've been shown to be fraudulent.
Right.
The more important thing is just to make a certain set of value commitments and to be a kind of semi-intellectual, semi-physicalist activist. And education is a kind of activism, right, in the classroom. And then you're exactly right that the way that comes out is in a kind of absolutism, right? So we might say we're skeptical about reason and its ability to come up with one true narrative about the way the world works, and so all we're stuck with is a plurality of narratives. And then we then say, well, if there's a plurality of narratives and none of them is better justified rationally than any other of them, we have to be kind of relativist and egalitarian with respect to all of those narratives. But that's an inherently unstable position, because each of the people who are inhabiting, right, those narratives, they're human beings. They want to be committed to something. They want their values to be important to them, to live them. But if they're told that they don't need to give a rational justification for them, and it's impossible really to understand somebody else's narrative and to have a debate to see which one is better and worse and to learn from each other, then what seems to make sense is just wholeheartedly to make a commitment to your narrative, to your set of values. Forget the idea that you need to be rational about it. Instead, just take it to the streets and do what you need to advance your positions.
This is sounding like it's explaining this phenomenon that I'm seeing among the younger college generation of saying that when someone disagrees with you politically, that they are invalidating you, that they are invalidating your existence. If someone doesn't believe in affirmative action, they are invalidating you, and that words are violence.
Sure, that's right. Part of that, I think, is psychologically true. If whatever you believe, if you know that you don't have arguments for it, right, that somehow you've just been born into a certain framework, you've been acculturated to it, and you weren't in control of that process, then the situation you're in is that you've got a strongly held set of beliefs that form your identity, and that really matters to you, but at the same time, you know that you're not in control of your identity. And that is a somewhat destabilized internal position to be psychologically. So anybody who does come along from another perspective and seems to have good facts and good arguments against something that you take to be important to your identity, that person is going to be a threat to you, right? Because you know that you don't have facts and arguments to defend who you are and to respond to that person. So in self-defense, right, what you will need is to find some way to not have to respond to that person, to take that person's criticisms and then just reject them. So, being able to say that, well, you're just coming from an alien perspective, you're attacking my perspective, you're attacking my identity, and you shouldn't do that, right? That enables you just to dismiss, right, all criticisms, and to bracket the person's objections, right, and throw them away. So, right, words as violence, right, the second part of your question there as well, right. Part of the whole postmodern package is to say that language, right, is not a cognitive tool in the modernist sense, right. It's not about getting the world right, coming up with category schemes that reflect the features of the natural world. It's not a set of tools that we then use to communicate ideas so that we find ways to adjust how you're parsing the world out and make it fit with the way I'm parsing the world out so that we get on the same page, right, metaphorically speaking. Language is not cognitive in that sense. If we are deeply skeptical, then we have to recast what we're doing, right, when we are using language, using words, right, and so forth. So language then is not a tool of cognition, right? Language is something else. It's merely a rhetorical tool. It's a tool that we use to try to influence other people, that other people try to use to influence us, but without any of that cognitive, right, stuff, right, that's going on. If you add to that, right, the idea that human relations are fundamentally conflictual, right, that your group's identity, right, your gender identity, your racial, ethnic, political identity, and so forth, and mine are in conflict with each other, then what that means is that language in our social intercourse with each other is a tool for dealing with that conflict, right? So it's a tool, kind of like a weapon, right? Just as you use weapons in physical conflict to manage your disagreements with other groups, language then is a weapon, right, that we will use in our conflicts, right, with other groups. So, yeah, language does amount to a kind of violence, but then it's just a matter of who gets to use the violent weapons, and it becomes a power struggle to control who gets to say what words under what circumstances.
And the ironic thing about this is that in the absence of these word weapons that we're describing, all there is violence. So if you can't solve problems through speech, the only thing that you have left is violence. And I wonder if they've fully reckoned with that fact.
Right. Well, absolutely. Because then right, when you get down to practical politics, words have a certain amount of power, and you can go some distance down the road, particularly with younger people, by manipulating their linguistic framework and their cognitive framework. But at a certain point, you say, all right, this is not the most powerful weapon we have at our disposal. And if you are very skeptical, then you're going to say, at a certain point, it's kind of pointless to try to reason and converse with people. Why don't we just go for the more powerful weapons, right? Get the sticks out, get the guns out, start using our fists. And if we have the advantage of numbers, we can prevail in the streets.
So just to touch back on what you said earlier about Marxism, you were talking about, the postmodern worldview as being one of, a kind of battleground, a sort of a power struggle. Jordan Peterson claims, and this is something that I'm kind of stuck on, he claims that postmodernism is a post-Marxist sleight of hand. This is an argument that he makes frequently. He says that the old Marxism rejected individualism, obviously capitalism, and saw the world as basically a battleground between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, which is obviously true. And that this argument failed to hold any sway in at the end of the 20th century, given everything that had happened, the catastrophes of communism and socialism. And that Marxists performed a sleight of hand when that wasn't working out somewhere around the 70s and said, okay, if it's not the poor against the rich, we'll make it the oppressed versus the oppressor. Is that really true, Stephen, what Dr. Peterson is saying? Are postmodernism and Marxism really one and the same philosophy? Do they share the same foundation? I know very little, I'll be honest, about Marxist theory. But weren't the old Marxists dialectical materialists? Didn't they believe in science and physical laws and evolution in the material world?
All right. Again, a very interesting set of observations, and partly it's a mixture of your gloss on Jordan Peterson's take, and then a little bit of yours toward the end of that. Let me say, I think it's wrong to identify postmodernism with Marxism or even with neo-Marxism. Postmodernism is broader, and here again, you do have to start fairly quickly, breaking things down. Just as we would say with Christianity, fairly quickly there are several versions of Christianity. There's Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, and so on. Not all postmoderns, are Marxist or even neo-Marxists. There is a significant strain of postmoderns who take the metaphysical or the anti-metaphysical material seriously. They take the anti-reason and then pro-skepticism, relativism seriously, and they downplay any normative side of postmodernism at all. So they would say the important thing about modernism is its metaphysical naturalism and its epistemological empiricism and rationalism. Those are all failures, and that's all that we mean by postmodernism. The value implications of that are entirely open. If you are skeptical about everything, if you are anti-realistic about everything, that includes being skeptical and anti-realistic about values. So there is no one value framework, including Marxism, that is the appropriate implication, that comes out of our postmodernism. Now, that said, there are nonetheless a significant number, and I would say a majority, of postmoderns of the last 2 or 3 generations for whom the postmodernism does work with a kind of Marxism / neo-Marxism, and so forth. Now, the 1970s, you mentioned that date. I don't know if that's your date or
That's
Jordan
Dr. Peterson's date.
Okay, that date. I think the evolution starts a lot earlier. Already by the 1890s, I would say you found a large number of Marxists who were academics and intellectuals who had said, already 50 years earlier, Marx and Engels had made the predictions about how capitalism's internal contradictions were going to realize themselves, bourgeoisie versus proletariat, rise of a revolutionary class, right, and so on. And that's not happening. And already the social science indicators are that society is not moving in the directions that classical Marxist theory says. So we need to rethink what Marxism is all about. And one of the things that they started to argue was, and you start to see this in the 1890s, the first generation of the 20th century, 1910s, 1920s, is to say that maybe we need to not be as reductively materialistic, particularly about economic matters, as classical Marxism is, that we need to broaden the Marxist oppressor versus oppressed framework to start to include other cultural variables, right? So at that point, Marxism is evolving into a broader cultural right Marxism. Now things get kind of interrupted by World War I, right, and everybody is focused on different things, but when intellectual activity picks up again after World War I, you start to see the rise of the Frankfurt School.
Right.
And so they are very important, 20s, 30s, right, and 40s. And what they're doing is a number of things, but partly merging classical Marxism with Freudianism and arguing that we need a much more sophisticated psychological theory and certainly a much more sophisticated social psychological theory, so that it's not just economic materialistic forces, right, that human psychology has those same oppressor versus oppressed dynamics, that instead of talking only about oppression, we need to talk about repression and the internal things, right, that go on inside the human psychology. And that, again, it's not just economics. Then by the 1950s, right, in the 1960s, you start to see, right, race versions, right, racial versions, ethnic versions, gender versions, environmental versions. At a high level of abstraction, they are retaining the classical Marxist language of exploitation, right, and oppression, but it is much more nuanced and much more wide-ranging in the cultural dimensions. So at that point, the old left is done. We're into the new left. Postmoderns, first generation's intellectuals, Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard, Rorty, and so forth, they are on the ascendancy. So I would say the intellectual groundwork has been long laid before we get to the 1970s.
Okay.
But what is true is in the 1970s is that there is, particularly after 1968, which was very important, particularly for the European intellectuals, important for the American intellectuals, but less so. After 1968, there is then again a rethinking about what left strategy is going to do, and so we do see again another significant shift occurring in the 1970s, and I think that's what Jordan Peterson is picking up on importantly.
Okay. So I want to talk now about the Western canon and postmodernism's rejection of the Western intellectual tradition. I was talking to Mark Bauerlein a few weeks ago. He's an Emory professor, and he was telling me that he had lunch with Lyotard, and at this lunch, Lyotard was stressing the importance of reading figures like Francis Fukuyama, who is like a neocon, and also of reading the Western classics. Other of the old guard postmodernists like Foucault and even Marcuse, they basically said you've got to read the Western classics if you're going to go about deconstructing them. Foucault apparently even recommended reading Friedrich Hayek. But this, I don't think, is happening anymore. The stress on reading the classics and the importance of reading the classics and teaching them in a way that is non-vindictive. Okay, so some postmodern professors have to teach the classics. It's a requirement for certain degrees. But I get the sense that it's being de-emphasized. Why is this happening? Why did the older postmodernists favor reading the classics? and why aren't we reading the classics anymore in our humanities departments?
All right, that's a great set of questions there. I think we could go off in 4 very interesting sub-discussions here. Right, one about the Western tradition as a whole and the rejection of the Western tradition. Lyotard and his insistence on reading it. Foucault's interest in Hayek and perhaps flirtations with neoliberalism, and then your nice point about even though earlier big name postmodernists are saying we have to engage with the Western tradition, that you don't see that happening. Instead, you get hey ho, Western civ has got to go among our generation, right, and so on. Let me say a couple of things here, right, initially. Lyotard in particular, I guess maybe true confessions here. My view is that of all of the postmoderns, he is perhaps the deepest, right, of them philosophically. My only reservation here would be Richard Rorty and the depth of his understanding of the analytic tradition is also extraordinarily, right, impressive. This is a very fine-grained judgment about 2 superlative intellects. But my sense is that Lyotard is perhaps the deepest read in all of the traditions and the one who is most fundamental, right, on all of them. I think particularly if one is at all interested in aesthetic theory and understanding why art, the art world broadly speaking, has gone the way that it has gone, Lyotard's reading of Kant and the post-Kantian traditions, particularly Kant's understanding of the sublime, is very powerful. And I'm struck by that in part because also in my book, the Explaining Postmodernism book, I place big importance, controversial importance on Kant as a significant turning point.
So if they've read Kant, that's what I don't understand here, is that how they arrived at the conclusions that they have if they read Kant. Like for Kant, even though human reason can't truly comprehend or know things in themselves, to use Kant's language, things are out there in the world still. At the end of the day, we have perceptions of these things, and we use these perceptions to make judgments, and we can make valid judgments. And the material world is still out there, even if we can't know it from its own side, to use a Buddhist phrase. How are they positing this? And how are they arriving at this conclusion, having read Kant?
Right. So I'm going to actually bracket that. That's an important question. I think that's your 4th right point about how we can be postmodern or be whatever it is, having read Kant or not necessarily having read Kant. So I was just wanting to at that point give some props to Lyotard, because we hear a lot about Foucault and Derrida and so on. But I would recommend that people who are most deeply interested in understanding postmodernism to kind of elevate Lyotard, right, a little bit more. As much as I disagree, right, fundamentally with Lyotard. You're also interestingly pointing about Foucault, and I do have a soft spot for much of that's overstated, for a significant amount of Foucault. One thing that is important about him is that he did evolve significantly, 50s, 60s, 70s, and on into the early 80s, right, when he died. And as you were pointing out, toward the end of his life, he did engage seriously with a thinker like Friedrich Hayek, Nobel Prize winner, right, in economics, and more broadly a very deep social philosopher as well. So Foucault, coming out of the French left, and in some cases the pretty far French left and hard French left, his willingness and open-mindedness to other cultural traditions and intellectual traditions such as Hayekian liberalism, that does say something about the cast of his mind. And that feeds in again to your other question, why do we not find that same cast of mind in this generation, right, of postmodern thinkers? It seems unimaginable, right, for them to engage seriously with Kant or with Hayek or anybody in the tradition. But let's back up and start with your first question about the Western tradition and the postmodern rejection, right, of the Western tradition. I don't think that's true. I think a better way to put it is to say that postmodernism represents a selective rejection of some elements, right, of the Western tradition. And to put it positively, I think a better way to put it is to say that postmodernism, despite its protestations, is in fact part of the Western tradition, and it represents in my view, a pathological end result, right, of some traditions that are homegrown, right, within Western intellectual and cultural traditions. So that then is to say, if you say, for example, in the case of Lyotard is well read in Kant, right, and he's tracing certain developments, right, that come out of that. Well, Kant is a part of the now classical Western tradition. If you want to make connections of postmodernism to Marxism and neo-Marxism and cultural Marxism, well, Marx is squarely, right, a part of the Western tradition. If you want to talk about someone like Stanley Fish, right, and his kind of rhetorical sophistry, right, well, when you push things way back to the Greeks, right, the sophists, right, and everything that they represent, that persistent strain of relativity and skepticism about various things, is now also a persistent, right, part of the Western tradition now for 2,600 years, right, or more. So postmodernism, I think, amounts to a contemporary repackaging and a very sophisticated working out of some elements that are native to the Western tradition and a critique of what they take to be other parts, right, of the Western tradition. So if we talk about the Western tradition, for example, it's natural, particularly in philosophy, for us to go back to the Greeks. And one slightly cartoonish, but nonetheless powerful way of understanding Greek intellectual life is to say that everything is an intellectual battle between the Platonists and the Aristotelians. Now, I don't think that's quite true, but there is some power there to say, all right, we are interested in truth, but where do we find truth, right? And so the Aristotelians are broadly naturalistic and scientific in their approach, right? The world is cause and effect through the power of empirical reason. We can understand the way the world works. The Platonists then say, well, no, the natural world left to its own devices is going to be ultimately chaotic and acausal, and if we're going to try to understand why there is order and causality in the world, we need to leave the natural world and go to a supernatural world, a world of forms. That's where we find timeless, eternal truths that are in some sense imposed, right, on the natural world. So you have a broadly naturalistic versus naturalistic approach, but both of them are believing that there is truth and there is ultimately right order, right, in the world. Now you can push that, if you push certain forms of Platonism, if you're going to really understand the higher world, how far can reason and logical argument take us in understanding it? And maybe the Platonists will say, well, ultimately there has to be some sort of mystical insight or revelation that is visited upon one. And then the pro-reason people will say, no, there is no mysticism, right, and so on. So we have a broadly empirical reason versus kind of mystical faith insight debate that is also characteristic. Now, that twofold debate. You can explain a lot of the Western intellectual tradition then in terms of a debate between the Platonists and the Aristotelians, right? The naturalists, and I'm reversing my order, right? The supernaturalists and the naturalists, right? The mystical faith tradition and the empirical reason tradition, right? And so forth. But if we go back to the Greeks, it is important that an important part of Greek intellectual life was the skeptical tradition as well. And that was homegrown. So you had the sophists, Protagoras, Gorgias,
right.
A crude sophist, right. In Plato's Republic early on, Thrasymachus, representing a very formidable challenge to Socrates, and through him to Plato as well. So I think a better way to understand the Western tradition is to see it in terms of an ongoing three-way debate, right? So you have, on the one hand, metaphysically, right, those who will argue that we should understand the natural world as having kind of causality built into it, and those who say no, that causality is imposed upon the natural world by a higher world that is actually the source of order and principles. And then the third tradition that argues against both of them, to say that in fact there is no ultimate causality and order. Instead we have a flux, an ultimate chaos, right? Kind of represented in a Heraclitean tradition, right, and so forth. Or epistemologically, right, between those who say ultimately if we want to know the truth, we need to turn to some sort of mystical revelation and have faith, right, in mystical revelations, right, versus those who say no, if we ultimately want to know the truth, we need to do the hard work of empiricism and mathematical logic and scientific method. But then against both of those, a third epistemological tradition that says there is no truth, we are ultimately ignorant, and skepticism and the outgrowths of that rule. So if you characterize things in that three-way tradition, then postmodernism, now jumping 2,500 years right to the present day, is not alien to the Western tradition. Instead, what it is a modern repackaging, a sophisticated version of that
sophism,
earlier.
Sophistry.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Right.
So when they say that they are anti-metaphysical and they're rejecting rather the Western tradition, right? What they are doing is rejecting Platonism, and they are rejecting Aristotelianism, right? Or they are rejecting naturalism and supernaturalism, right? Or they are rejecting both the claims of mysticism and faith and the claims of empirical rationalism. So
would you say that what is happening now, this sort of, I think there's a new branch that is extending out, this tendency of critiquing the West based on the fact that the works of the Western canon do not meet our 21st century progressive standards of equity and propriety. Is that an outgrowth of postmodernism? Is that seems to be the dominant rejection of the Western canon on campuses today, that it just shouldn't be read because it's in a sense dangerous. You need a trigger warning on it.
Yes. So, right. So all of that, I think, it's a rhetorical strategy. It's part of a power play among second or third generation, right, postmoderns, right, of our generation. Because then if you talk about the Western tradition the way that you and I have just been talking about it, you say, well, look, that whole Platonic tradition has a lot of very powerful defenders, as does the Aristotelian tradition, and that the only way then to defend your version of what ultimately is the right set of values is to take on the entire Western tradition. And my sense is that the vast majority of young people who are activist-minded, they don't want to do that much intellectual work. Right? They're going to take their initial course, start reading Plato and Augustine and Aquinas and people in the various other traditions, say, wow, these guys are really brilliant. What are the chances that I'm going to be able to outthink them and outsmart them and then convince a number of people of the right philosophical framework, right, and so on. I want a shortcut. They know they're cheating, but many people are not that intellectually honest, and they're willing to take various shortcuts to advance, right, whatever their agenda is. So, but at the same time, they are, as younger people now, third generation, hearing from their professors, right, who are now going to be, right, mid-career, that they don't have to, right, take on, right, that tradition, right, because part then of the Western tradition has been to say that if you are going to be intellectually honest, right, methodologically, right, what you need to do is understand the best arguments on all sides of various controversial debates.
Mill's advice. You need to take Mill's advice.
Exactly.
He who knows only his own side knows little of that.
Perfectly said. Right, chapter 2 of On Liberty. One of the great classic statements of what a liberal education, right, really consists in. And Mill, in that sense, is an optimist, right, in saying that if we do that hard work, and we actually have to do the hard work if we still believe in truth, that's the only way ultimately to do it. And teachers and professors actually have a very deep moral responsibility, right, not to put their thumbs on the scale too much, simply to indoctrinate students. Instead, the teacher's fundamental responsibility is to educate students in the best, right, of the traditions, the arguments on both sides, and then ultimately train the individual student's capacity for exercising individual judgment for himself, right, or herself. Now, all of that then goes away by the time we get to second generation postmoderns, because they don't believe in debate and reason as ultimately progressive, right? They don't believe in it philosophically, but then, as you were just saying about 3 minutes ago, they ultimately, many of them have value commitments of their own, and when they look at what has gone on, partly, or say, kind of first historically in Western civilization, but what now seems to be increasingly a global civilization, is that the dominant traditions now, or the traditions that have most prevailed coming out of the West, have been very successful in some regards. Some of the things you were starting to talk about earlier, right? We do now have more democracy, right? More liberalism,
less slavery, more
slavery,
women's rights.
Right. That's right. And all of that, right, came out of a strong individualism, right? That all human beings, and a universalism, right? All human beings, no matter what their economic background, no matter what their color of their skin, no matter what their ethnicity or religious orientation, no matter what their sex or gender, all human beings have certain inalienable, right, human rights, life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness, that all individuals have the capacity for reason, and so we can trust them, and we should train that capacity for reason by making everyone literate and making sure that they get a good education.
The American Creed.
Exactly, that's right. Now, within the American creed, or broadly, more speaking, within the Western European tradition, and then more broadly now just global civilization, we can have a debate, right, about whether some sort of Platonic / Judeo-Christian, right, understanding of where those firm universalistic principles come from, or whether it's a much more naturalistic, kind of Aristotelian, Lockean, Hobbesian understanding that is the source of that. Right. But what both of those sides have in common, right, is the idea that there are universal principles, that we do have to respect the individual and have certain rights and so forth. And that tradition, or that conjoining, right, of those two sub-traditions within the Western tradition has been very, successful. And so if, you are committed, to a different tradition, you want to be some sort of Marxist, or you want to be some sort of Rousseauian, or some sort of updated version of leftism, then you have to, find some way to reject the successes of the Western intellectual traditions and the Western cultural traditions.
I wonder if you read Edward Herman's book, The Cave in the Light.
I've not.
Based on everything that you've been talking about, that would be one that I would recommend to my listeners. I want to touch on one last thing, Professor Hicks.
Sure.
Postmodernism's criticism of science. I remember I watched a YouTube video of Richard Dawkins, who came out against the postmodern abuses of science, and he was talking about the feminist philosopher Luce Irigaray, who claimed that Newton's Principia is a rape manual. She argued that E equals mc squared was a sexed equation, in that it privileges the speed of light and all of this stuff. That fluid mechanics is being oppressed by more masculine physics. This can't be real. Is this real, Stephen? Is this part of the postmodern ethos right now?
It is, although I believe Luce Irigaray, the E equals mc squared and privileging the speed of light, that part is correct. I think the Newton's Principia being a rape manual, I believe that should be ascribed to Sandra Harding. But that of course is a detail, and your broader question is about postmodernism's attitude right towards science and the offshoots right of science and so on. I think it's right to say that for the postmoderns, science is just one more narrative, and the same deconstruction of all narratives is going to be applied to science. You do find this coming out in a variety of forms. Some people will note that it's been mostly white people, right, historically, who first institutionalized science. So you'll have racialist versions of postmodernism who are that will criticize science for being just a white way of thinking, right? Or kind of feminist postmoderns will argue that since most of the work has been done by males historically, and they might conjoin that with what really sounds like old-fashioned crude sexism. That males are more rational and logical, and females are more emotional and empathetic. That privileging scientific method is unfair and sexist, right, and so on. You find in ethnocentric, right, versions of postmodernism the idea that science is European primarily in origin, but what about African ways of knowing, or Asian ways of knowing, or Native American ways of knowing, and so forth. So the idea then is going to be, again, the creek that science puts itself forth as not only a narrative, right, but ultimately one true, right, narrative that should hold ultimately for all human beings. The skepticism and relativism that comes out of postmodernism naturally is going to put it at odds, right, with that. Now, again, people outside of various Western traditions can want to uphold their traditions against what seems to be a very successful, scientifically based model. But the most powerful arguments against science's universalist pretenses, right, from the postmodern perspective, are again internal to the Western tradition. Here, Thomas Kuhn is very important. I know there are lots of people who like Kuhn and give him what I think of as a softer interpretation. I think if you just read Kuhn as a historian of scientist or of science, or as a sociologist of science, then he's very perceptive and does a lot of very good work. But in his more philosophical moments, he does explicitly say that we have to reject the notion of truth and the idea that science helps us get closer to the truth. And he does undercut explicitly, right, any notion of science being progressive.
Even a priori truths? Do we have to reject the truth of 2 + 2 = 4?
Yes. And there are
good luck with that.
There are good internal to the Western traditional understandings, right, of epistemological. That's turning into a noun pileup. Broadly epistemological concerns, right, narrower understandings of where we get our concepts from, and then sophisticated arguments about philosophy of language and semantics that lead one to skeptical objections to even 2 + 2 = 4. And Thomas Kuhn, right, again, getting his education, first-rate history of science and philosophy of education in the 40s and 50s. By the time he writes in the early 1960s, the structure of scientific revolutions, right, is drawing on all of those traditions and precisely saying, if we understand the history of science properly and the philosophy of science properly, we have to bracket and set aside the notions of truth, fact, right, logic as being realistic, and progress. And it's not accidental then that the next generations of postmodern thinkers take Thomas Kuhn and cite him and run with that ball very far down the football field, right, so to speak. It's also important, again, to say that this is within the Western intellectual tradition and not alien to it. Paul Feyerabend, writing, again, someone who is very sophisticatedly educated within analytic philosophy, knowing very well the ins and outs of Karl Popper's more science-friendly tradition, arguing again and concluding by the time we get to the 1960s that yes, science is a very powerful narrative, right? But it is just one more narrative, and we have no good basis for thinking that science's narrative is any better than witchcraft's narratives, right? Or magical thinking's, right? Narratives, right? And so forth. They are all just narratives. So yes, science is bracketed. Now, if you then conjoin science as just being one narrative, but somehow it has become a very powerful narrative, you can join that with the entire power narrative that power necessarily is zero-sum. The strong always use their narrative at the expense of the weak. Then you are going to say whites, males, Europeans, and so forth are just using this scientific narrative to oppress non-whites, non-males, non-Europeans, and then all of the pathological forms of postmodern anti-science come out in the second and third generation.
But it isn't zero-sum.
Okay, so then we go back right to your response to the very first question. What do we say to the actual data, if we're allowed to use the language of actual data, right? That seems to show that, in fact, right, it's not zero-sum, that in fact science and liberalism and the other traditions initially coming out of Westernism and now being exported and happily imported to other parts of the world are in fact improving the human condition. And so here I would say yes. The postmoderns, by the time we get into our generation, have to willfully blind themselves to the data. Right? Life expectancy has improved immeasurably.
Violence has gone down.
Violence has gone down. It's a beautiful thing. The halving of the poverty rates, whether you're talking about extreme poverty or more relative versions, right, of poverty. The modest openness of China and India to Westernism over the course of the last 2 generations now, and lifting, and now I believe the number is over 700 million people out of extreme poverty. That is that's awesome. The fact that Western women first now enjoy freedoms, incredibly progressive, right, on getting rid of slavery are genuine achievements, right? So I do think there is a moral fault to all of those postmoderns in our generation who, to my extent, are willfully not paying attention to the data. They are inside an intellectual bubble, and they are not willing to look outside of that intellectual bubble. And unfortunately, I think one of the things that we do have to say is that we know that one of the things that's true about human psychology is, particularly when one is young, it's very easy to get yourself committed to a normative framework, and then to hold on to that normative framework in a very strongly faithful fashion. to blind yourself, right? Blind faith is a powerful psychological mechanism to seal yourself off to any other reasonable position, to not be willing to take criticisms of your own position, to be willing to say, yeah, even though those other guys, I disagree with them, they can be decent human beings with good arguments for their position, to be willing actually to sit down and look at some data, look at some graph, learn some statistics, study some other cultures, actually learn the history and to realize how bad the bad old days were. If you're not actually willing to do that, I do think that's a moral failing. And we do now have a dominant intellectual framework in Western intellectual and life ensconced in the humanities that is encouraging a large number of young people to adopt precisely that pathological psychological framework.
Oh, that's a great reminder and an excellent way to wrap up our conversation. Professor Hicks, I really appreciate you spending the time with me today. And is there anything that you want to notify my listeners about, whether it's something that you're working on or a special work of the Western Canon that is close to your heart?
Well, yes, I'm working on that on a few projects right now, but my big writing project is the follow-up book to the Explaining Postmodernism. That's mostly a negative work. It's an intellectual history of postmodernism, but on my view, it's pathological, and I don't argue the positive. So that's what I'm working on now. No, what I would say is nothing that's too original, but do take John Stuart Mill's advice. People have wide-ranging interests. Do follow your own interests. But people who are in the Western tradition, who are the big names, make sure you know something about them. Engage with their arguments. If you're not getting a good classically liberal education from your professors and in your own reading, go out of your way to identify who the important names in history that one should know, and give yourself a good education. That's the long-term health for yourself as an individual, and certainly it's the long-term health of civilization.
Well, that's fantastic advice, and thank you again. And I hope you'll consider coming on when we talk about the Enlightenment thinkers. That'll be probably years down the road at this rate. So
yeah, absolutely. Happy to spend time with you again. It was a good conversation. Yeah, the Western tradition, there are some thinkers we can engage with more. I know you're interested in Nietzsche. Maybe we can have a good conversation.
That would be perfect.
We'll have a conversation about Nietzsche too.
Sounds great.
Okay, bye for now.
Bye-bye.